Bonjour. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the, you can hear me, yeah? For accepting this paper, to the organizing committee, and for pulling all this together. This is the first time I'm presenting at a mostly French conference, so I'm really glad that you all speak more languages than I do. I should say before I start that this is actually also my first foray into this kind of work. As you've heard, I mostly work on Arabic publishing and Arabic printing, but what this project did was sort of bring two things together. The first is the fact that I'm now teaching at AUB and teaching Islamic art, and I have access to this museum, and I teach classes in here, so I've been looking at this material a lot. The other thing is the history of the American University of Beirut is a Protestant missionary history directly related to the first book that I wrote on publishing in the Arab world, where a lot of the missionaries were first involved in this project. And so that's how this comes together. And it's not going to be about the Dome of the Rock itself, but rather tiles from the Dome of the Rock that are currently on display or have recently come on display at this museum. So the title is Tales of Tiles, Narratives about a Museum's Collection of Dome of the Rock Revetments. On February 25, 2015, the Archaeological Museum at the American University of Beirut, which I will now refer to as AUB, in Lebanon, inaugurated its newly reorganized Islamic collection. This collection's display of pre-Islamic to 18th century ceramic shards, tiles, and vessels from Iran, Iraq, and regions in the Eastern Mediterranean occupies a smallish, square-shaped interior, and I'm showing it here on the plan, that makes up about only 5% of the museum's building. Anchoring this modest collection are 5 18th century polychromatic glazed tiles, believed to have once graced the facade of one of Islamic architecture's most discussed structures, the Jerusalem's 7th century Dome of the Rock. The local prominence of the inauguration is evident in the fact that it took place under the patronage of Auji, Lebanon's former Minister of Culture, but he was the Minister of Culture at this time, and he was accompanied, as they always are, by his entourage of other government officials, some having nothing to do at all with culture, as well as local dignitaries. Delivering the museum's opening lecture was renowned artist and architectural historian John Carswell, who had served as a professor of art at AUB in the 1960s. The AUB Museum claims that in an impromptu visit to the collection, Carswell, who was in town for some visit, I'm not sure what date, they don't quite give a date, identified and dated these tiles. So it's due to him that we know that these are Dome of the Rock tiles. Interestingly, according to the museum catalog from 1951, the earliest in which these tiles are specifically mentioned, they were located amongst other tiles on the bottom shelf of case 22. So you can see case 22, that longish one, then case 23. So these are really old-fashioned 19th century style cases. So it's the very, very bottom. So it's the floor shelf of that particular case. So case 22, along with case 23, displayed other examples of Islamic glazed pottery and tiles alongside Byzantine ones as well. But by 2015, these tiles had moved to serve as centerpieces in the Islamic collection. And this reminded me, attending in the first session today, the first panel, this discussion of how the shifting value of the objects is seen in the archives, but you also see it in the space of the museum, how they go from the dusty bottom of a cabinet to suddenly being displayed and being the major centerpieces of this new collection. The museum's current display highlights the revetment's connection to the Dome of the Rock through a photograph of the structure's south porch printed on a window screen. So this, what you're seeing, is an image that's been printed on a screen that's acting as a curtain as well. When you first go in, you think, oh, is this an actual reconstruction of that? But it's not. It's a print. And the photo is actually repeated in the exhibition's display materials below the display tiles with arrows showing you where each of the 5 hanging tile revetments would have been originally located on the Dome of the Rock's facade. So the visual reconstruction, which is also available on the website, and that's what I downloaded here, shows visitors how the museum's experts took fragmentary items and located them as part of a comprehensible whole. What is not quite understood, however, is how these tile revetments ended up in this collection in the first place. The museum tells a tale, while available records paint a much more complex and even contradictory versions of this account. My paper today endeavors to carefully trace these narratives, not for revisionist purposes, but to explore their wider implications and functions across the history of the museum and its parent institution, AUB. Since the late 20th century, museological studies have expounded upon the socio-political implications of museum collections and displays, with the understanding that notions of which objects are deemed valuable and what these markers of value are vary according to an institution's motives and the approaches of its employees. In the case of the AUB Museum, this paper explores how the construction and promotion of a historical account from a single set of tiles through which dates, events, and individuals were brought together as a narrative of factual representation. This not only shows the museum's propagation of and preference for an idealist versus a materialist reading of history, but also provides insights into how smaller private museums in the region strive for broader interests in staking claims for relevance in the global cultural arena. So I'm going to begin with a brief history of the AUB Museum and its collection before bringing us back to the tiles themselves with a consideration of 4 main things. The first thing is the museum's narrative, the official narrative. The second thing is the problems that I will raise with this narrative. The third point is alternate narratives that they could have chosen. And the fourth are some concluding thoughts and points for further research. So I must say this is part of a very new, for me, and part of a larger project. So this is just a snippet of that. So starting with the history, the AUB Archaeological Museum was founded in 1868 by Dr. George Post, a medical professor at the Syrian Protestant College, which is what AUB was originally called. The Syrian Protestant College was established in 1866 as an extension of the Boston-based American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, who had set up the Syria mission in the 1820s. So these are Presbyterian missionaries coming in from Boston. This mission's headquarters were in Beirut, which at the time was an Ottoman sanjak, or a prefecture, in the Syrian province. The AUB's collection began as a small group of cabinets containing eclectic objects that were donated by professors who taught at the college. So initially it starts with a very personal set of collections of knickknacks. The collection at the time included cabinets covering minerals, botany, geology, and zoology. The Cabinet of Antiquities, as the archaeological collection was then called, was made up almost exclusively of coins, some pottery, and busts, Palmyran busts mostly. Thus, the so-called museum functioned more as a collection of cabinets, a sort of cabinets of curiosities, for use in course instruction. In the late 19th century, the AUB Museum was one of a few similar so-called museums in the Ottoman world, which for their first few decades served more as collections or depositories than public sites of exhibition and display. These collections included the Imperial Arms Depot of St. Iran Church in Istanbul, which supposedly was set up in 1846. There's the Archaeological Egyptian Museum in Cairo, which we heard a little bit about today, set up in the late 1850s, and the Imperial Museum at Istanbul in Topkapi Palace that was essentially first started as a collection in 1869. This was also followed by Cairo's Museum of Arab Art in the 1880s, and then Jerusalem's Imperial Museum in 1890. Unlike other regional museums at this time, however, the AUB Museum was not connected to any government or state apparatus. For example, unlike the imperial museums in Istanbul and Jerusalem, which became the main depositories for Ottoman antiquities, the museum in Beirut remained at the fringe as a smaller private collection closely tied to the practices of its Protestant college. The AUB Museum's missionary commitment was evident in its focus on biblical archaeology, which was solidified in 1887 with the college's establishment of its own school of biblical archaeology and philology. And that was actually based on the School of Classical Antiquities at the American similar institute here. It was then that the collection acquired funding and also took on a didactic role and came to call itself a museum. Some of that funding went to building a new structure, which was completed in 1902, when the museum was moved to a newly built post-science hall. So, sorry, I was supposed to show you this earlier. This is the new, the post-science hall that is still the building used today, so nothing much has changed on this building. And this collection in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, encompassed a collection of antiquities and botany. The botany was later categorized and used as natural evidence of biblical history. So this is how the biblical history came tied into this. The AUB Museum continued to serve as the only archaeology museum in Beirut until 1937, when the National Museum was established during the French Mandate of Lebanon. When the AUB Museum reopened in 1948, after having been closed during World War II, its building was renovated and its collection was reinstalled, becoming an exclusively archaeological museum by 1951, when it shed its botanical collection. Its restructuring included whitewashing any connection to its missionary period focus on biblical history by taking a cue from Beirut's National Museum and focusing on a narrative that privileged local Lebanese heritage, specifically that of the connection between Maronite Lebanese to Phoenician history. Of course, this connection was espoused by French scholars, Ernest Renan, and then it was promoted very, very broadly in the French Mandate. While the museum remained open during the Lebanese Civil War between 1975 and 1990, it stood more as a dusty remnant of a bygone era, the stillness of its antiquities in stark contrast with the destruction and conflicts of everyday life in Beirut at the time. The AUB Museum's complete renovation between 1999 and 2006, which coincided with AUB's 140th anniversary, speaks to the institution's commitment to making itself relevant in a changing environment. Plans for the designation of an Islamic art collection. So there was no Islamic art collection designated before 2006, before actually 2011. So this essentially, so before the contemporary moment is what I'm trying to say, the Islamic art objects were not called Islamic art objects, they were called Arab, sometimes Saracen, sometimes labeled Syrian origin, Iranian origin, or wherever, and they were mixed in with all of the other objects at this time. So the first time when you're getting this bringing together of Islamic art together as under the label of Islamic art, this takes place in around 2011. And then the new Islamic corner of the museum was completed in 2014, and officially it was launched in 2015. So with that history done, I'm going back to the tiles. So these are the 5 glazed tile revetments that are currently on display at the AUB Museum. And they're believed to be ones dating to about 1721, 1722. They were supposedly used, these are the ones that were supposedly used in the restoration of the Dome of the Rock that was ordered by Sultan Ahmed III and produced in Syria. According to the museum display text, the tiles used before the 18th century were bored horizontally on their 4 sides for the insertion of copper pins, which linked the tiles together and which were in turn hooked into masonry behind. But this ingenious solution was not completely successful. The tiles fell off and were then replaced by Syrian copies. It is understood from this text and my brief consultation of a few visual and textual sources on the subject that the tile revetments at the AUB Museum are not the first set of underglazed tiles from the 16th century. Those were produced by Persian potters to replace the original Umayyad period mosaics. The ones in the museum are the copies that were produced by Syrian potters during the 18th century, when continued restoration was done on the Dome of the Rock. Additionally, the museum director herself notes that since the tiles on display include numbers from a cataloging system that the museum used before 1926, then the tiles must have made their way to the museum's collection before that date. This stretch of time from the founding of the museum's collection in 1868 to its new cataloging system in 1925 coincides with several phases of the Dome of the Rock's restoration. The structure's exterior was restored over the course of several centuries, from 1537 to 1966. Of relevance here are the restoration projects that dated to around before 1951, specifically those that took place during the late Ottoman period, and I list those dates up here, and during the British mandate to Palestine, and those dates were in the 1920s. This means that the tiles currently on display at the museum could have been ones that had been removed any time between these dates. What is not understood is how and when these tiles traveled from Jerusalem to the museum's collection in Beirut. This is what Leila Badr, the current museum director, in her remarks during the collection's inauguration ceremony, tells us she set out to solve. A journey that took her, quote, on a quest that would make Sherlock Holmes proud, end quote. According to Badr in the museum's exhibition text, in 1879, Frederick Bliss, and this guy is the son of the university's founder, the first president, Daniel Bliss, donated a collection of Palestinian pottery to the AUB Museum. He was in 1890 involved with the Museum of Antiquities in Jerusalem, hence bringing the above three dates and events together. The late 1800s, around 1873 to 1890, reflects a reasonable date for the revival of these glazed elements, along with a collection of Palestinian pottery at the AUB Museum. In a museum publication, an article on this particular subject explains that during the restoration of the structure, the Dome of the Rock, in the late 19th century, and I'm quoting, AUB's Frederick Bliss was still working in Jerusalem. The adage was that the removed tiles were piled in the Haram al-Sharif as rubbish. Bliss selected example tiles from these piles, and upon permission, brought them home to Beirut and donated them to the AUB Museum. So this is the narrative that's provided by all of the museum's publications. So now my job is to kind of reconsider this and to rethink this, and that's what we're going to do now. So Frederick Jones Bliss, the eldest son of Daniel Bliss, was born in Souq al-Gharib, which is a village near Beirut. He was born in 1859, where his father, Daniel, served as a member of the Protestant Syria's mission. Frederick Bliss graduated in 1880 from Amherst College in Massachusetts and rejoined his family in Beirut, where he served for a couple of years as the head of the preparatory department at the Syrian Protestant College, before then returning to the US to study at New York's Union Theological Seminary until 1887. In 1891, he joined the Palestine Exploration Fund, a British society founded in 1865. At the recommendation of the fund, one of the fund's members and fellow professor at the college, Dr. George Post, who also started the museum. Bliss was to serve as a successor of the famed archaeologist Flinders Petrie, who was leading the Palestinian Exploration Fund's expedition in Tel el-Hassi, which ran from around 1891 to 1893. Bliss later led his own expedition for the PEF in Jerusalem, and that ran from 1894 to 1897, where he focused on an area of the city walls south of Haram al-Sharif. His connection with the PEF ended in 1900, when he was told that the society no longer needed to fund his expedition. At this time, between 1890 and 1903, he had been involved in the planning and cataloging process of the Imperial Museum in Jerusalem by invitation from Ottoman officials. So, returning to the narrative details of the AUB Museum's connection between the tiles and Bliss, numerous inconsistencies and concerns arise, of which I will only discuss 3 today. The first and the most simple problem is related to the dates given for the arrival of the tiles to AUB, which are 1873 to 1890. So Bliss at this time was only 14 years old. So 1873 is out. He didn't complete all of his higher education in the US until 1887. And he did not join the PEF nor make excursions to Jerusalem until 1891. The supposed donation by Bliss in 1879 of a collection of Palestinian pottery is also improbable, given the fact that he was still at Amherst College at this time. Indeed, a consideration of the dates problematizes the museum's narrative that Bliss made any donation to the museum between 1873 to 1890. The second problem I have with this is the issue of acquiring the necessary permission to make a selection of tiles from the religious structure and to take them from the site and deposit them in a private missionary institution during the late Ottoman period. While European excavations had taken place in a haphazard fashion in the Ottoman domains from the mid-18th to the mid-19th century, by 1869 the state issued its first bylaw regulating the excavation and collection of antiquities. The Ottoman laws developed in the last decades of the 19th century, in 1874 and 1884, made it more difficult for foreigners not only to excavate, but it also made it almost impossible to transport any artifacts from the approved excavation sites. Any antiquities found in digs needed to be moved to the Imperial Museum in Istanbul. A government commissioner was assigned to each excavation team to ensure their compliance with the law. Of course, it's still possible that they didn't follow the rules. In fact, the excavators frequently tried to trick their government commissioners into thinking that some items, like pottery shards, were not of any historical significance. However, Bliss was known and he was criticized for being a supporter of the Ottoman government's regulations. And had he indeed been granted permission to remove material from Haram al-Sharif, which at this time, in the 1890s, was still a religious site that non-Muslims needed special permission to access, he would have made note of this in some record when he donated the objects to the museum. This brings me to the third conundrum in the AUB Museum story, the fact that these tiles and their supposed donation by Bliss are missing from records on the provenance of the museum's collection during the 19th century. And here I want to just bring in a quick point on the problem with archives. When it comes to the museum's collection, there's no archival material. The records, the missionary records, claim that every item was properly provenance. We know where it came from. Not only do we know who gave it to us, we know where it was originally located. But when you talk to the museum today and you say, I want to do archival research, there's nothing. You know, mafishi, no, don't come, don't bother. And if you want to see something, it's forbidden, mamnoa. And so the archives are, I don't know if they exist, but I know that they are inaccessible, is what I want to say. To me, okay, that's all I want to say. So I instead turn to annual reports and the museum's own publications as my sources. The Syrian Protestant College's annual reports to the Board of Trustees, for example, typically included a curator's note on any additions to the college's collections. There is no mention in any of these reports, and I looked at all of them until 1951, of a donation by Bliss, nor an addition of ceramic tiles of any kind. The first mention of a gift by Bliss in the museum's first catalog was published in 1921, which reads, a few donations had been made of pottery and minor objects by Mr. Frederick J. Bliss. The catalog does not give a date for this gift, nor does it cite any sources. It should be noted that the tiles may be minor objects. amongst the examples of pottery. Indeed, one can't overlook the fact that at this time, artifacts like Ottoman tiles would not have been considered valuable at a time when European and American archaeologists prized ancient antiquities that reinforced the hegemonic narrative of a Western classical past. Nevertheless, the lack of any mention of Bliss's gift to the AUB Museum before 1921 complicates the museum's current narrative. Add to this the fact that the first time the tiles themselves are mentioned is in the museum's catalog from 1951, published after the collection was unpacked and reorganized upon the conclusion of World War II, during which the artifacts had been protected in wooden cases and the museum's doors were closed to the public. What is most notable about the inconsistencies in the AUB Museum's narrative is the institution's insistence on ironing them out to present a uniform history of these 5 glazed tiles, despite these clearly factual inaccuracies. The definitive nature of the AUB Museum's narrative evokes the confident archaeology of the 19th century that came from an empiricist and essentialist approach to excavations and making grand acquisitions in the field. My concern here is not with providing a revisionist history or deriding the inauthenticity of the AUB Museum's narrative. Again, I still work there, and so I'm going to be very careful about what I say. I'm hoping nobody here will share this with them at any point before I go up for tenure at least. Rather, my interest is in demonstrating how the museum's idealization of history seeks to shift the narrative to where this institution wants to go, rather than following the different routes that the material artifacts and the documents available on hand can actually take it. Looking closer at the available sources, even at the tiles themselves, one can posit numerous alternate narratives of these objects' history, and their transport to the museum's collection. For example, returning to the dates provided by the museum director, she explains that the 5 tiles made their way to the collection before 1925, when the museum's cataloging system had changed. Although she locates the possible years during which these tiles were donated as being between 1873 and 1890, the range of years from 1891 to 1925 are left out. These later years would actually make more sense for the narrative that Frederick Bliss donated these items. For one thing, he remained in Jerusalem until at least 1903. After his time in Jerusalem, Bliss went to the US and only returned to Syria in 1914 during World War I, where he stayed until 1919. However, then he returned to Jerusalem around 1920 as an archaeological advisor. He was around 60 at this time. Indeed, the interwar period between World War I and World War II was seen as the golden age of archaeology on the Near East, with the end of Ottoman rule and the subsuming former territories under various mandates, particularly in regions like Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. The mandate period allowed for unfettered access to previously closed-off sites like mosques and Islamic monuments, like those on the Haram al-Sharif. In fact, Bliss himself was present during the retiling of the Dome of the Rock in the early years of the British Mandate, when he visited the Haram al-Sharif at that time. And he actually described this in an article from 1920. Ironically, an acquisition date between 1921 and 1925 is further corroborated by the AUB Museum's own catalogs. The previously discussed catalog from 1921, where a donation by Bliss is mentioned for the first time, is one example. Another is an entry from a 1951 catalog where the then curator, Dorothy McKay, describes these styles in her notes as enameled Turkish ware, a Turkish work, tile work. She dates it to the 15th century, maybe from the Mosque of Umar in Jerusalem, which was what they call the Dome of the Rock, which was retiled in part after World War I. She thus insinuates that these tiles may have been brought to the AUB Museum during this time. This would line up with Bliss's later visits to Jerusalem, where he could have plucked some of these tiles from those being removed and brought them home to Beirut with little issue. Of course, it's equally possible that these tiles made their way through another donation or even a purchase. The institution's, AUB's annual reports, for instance, indicate that at least 2 major donors who donated objects, not including Bliss, had ties to Jerusalem. Another alternate thread, and here I'm going out on a limb, to consider that really throws another wrench in the museum's current narrative regarding these tiles is the possibility that these revetments were not from the Dome of the Rock. Other structures on the Haram al-Sharif were also being restored during this period between 1870 and 1925, such as the Dome of the Chain, Ibit al-Silsila. This pavilion-like structure may have been erected around the same time of the Dome of the Rock, and it serves as a marker for numerous events, including the Prophet's nightly journey and his ascension into heaven. Like the Dome of the Rock, the Dome of the Chain was also retiled during different restorations since those of the 16th century. The two photographs that are seen here, one shows the Dome of the Chain in the 19th century with some of the 16th century tiles missing, and the other, more recently taken one, shows evidence of retiling as well as some similarity with the tiles on the Dome of the Rock. In fact, the smaller proportions of the tiles on the Dome of the Chain appear by sight to be similar to those of the tiles exhibited at the museum. And this was always something that bothered me because they're really small in comparison to what you're seeing on the Dome of the Rock itself. So my concluding thoughts on this. And these are just a few alternate narratives that the AUB Museum either unintentionally overlooked or deliberately issued when working on reconfiguring and reframing their Islamic art collection. This raises questions as to why these alternate narratives were overlooked, or more importantly, what the reasons behind the museum constructing the Bliss and Dome of the Rock narrative, what the reasons were behind constructing this specific institutional narrative as part of its past. While such a consideration requires further research and extends beyond the purview of this paper, I would like to conclude with a few ruminations on these points. One being the fact that the privileging of specific narratives in the space of the museum does not necessarily lead to the erasure of its alternates. Indeed, recent scholarship on museums has underscored the fact that museums are a far cry from being a system of seamless, structured, purposeful, strategic processes of gathering things according to a system that the features of which are very clearly defined. In fact, museums, even while being scripted spaces, as Carol Duncan has told us, that strive towards coherence, are not indelible, nor are they able to efface glitches and inconsistencies and discordant narratives. The AUB Museum's insistence on a historical narrative that tells the story of the 19th century acquisition from Frederick Bliss of definitively Dome of the Rock tiles tells us more about the institution's present-day roadmap than its past. What is evident in the AUB Museum's Islamic section is the coming together of two seemingly diametrically opposite strands. One, the valorization of AUB's missionary past, and two, the drive to promote a connection to a local Islamic heritage. The 5 glazed tile revetments' connection to Frederick Bliss, son of AUB's founder, coupled with the notion that he sought permission to bring them to Beirut from Ottoman authorities during the 19th century and not British colonizers of the 1920s, poetically weaves these two threads together. Connecting these tiles to the Dome of the Rock, one of the most emblematic structures in Islamic art and culture of the region, lends the museum's otherwise very, very modest collection both contemporary relevance and credibility. In fact, no other institution in Lebanon boasts a similar collection of tiles. Finally, it's no accident that the launch of an exclusively Islamic arts section in the museum coincided with both the founding of the first Islamic Studies section in the Islamic Studies program at AUB, and the university's 150th anniversary as the first Western-style institution of higher learning in the region. Thus, I would suggest what the AUB Museum's Tale from Tiles demonstrates is an attempt at regaining cultural and regional relevance, particularly with the rise of more global museums in the Arab world, like the now very famous Louvre in Abu Dhabi, the Guggenheim, and Doha's Museum of Islamic Art. Thank you.